They sold us lies in St. Louis, beautiful, gleaming lies wrapped in the language of opportunity and manifest destiny. I was 23 years old when I first heard the word frontier spoken like a promise rather than a threat. The year was 1847, and the man doing the speaking wore a clean wool suit that had never known mud or blood. He stood on a platform outside the land office, his voice carrying across the crowd of farmers, tradesmen, and desperate men looking for a fresh start. Free land, he said, his teeth white and straight. Rich soil, abundant game. A man can carve out an empire with nothing but his 2 hands and his will. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I killed more living things in my first year on the frontier than in all my previous years combined. Not because I was violent, not because I was cruel, but because survival in the wilderness wasn't the romantic adventure the land agents promised. It was war, endless, exhausting, intimate war with a natural world that didn't want us there, and made that abundantly clear with every sunrise. 3 families left St. Louis that spring with dreams of homesteading in the Kansas Territory. The Hendersons James, his wife Mary, and their 4 children ranging from 3 to 12. The Kowalski Stefan and Anna, newly married, barely 20 years old. And me, traveling with my father, my younger brother Daniel, and my father's second wife, Ruth, who had never spent a night outside a city. We were fools, every last one of us. The war began before we even reached our claim. It was the 3rd week of travel, somewhere in the emptiness between the Missouri River and the Kansas grasslands, when the mosquitoes found us. Not the occasional pest that buzzes near your ear at dusk. I'm talking about clouds of them, biblical swarms that blackened the air and covered every inch of exposed skin. Daniel was the first to break. He was 15, strong and stubborn, but that night he wept as he scratched at his arms until they bled. Ruth tried to console him, but her own face was swollen from bites, her eyes nearly shut. We burned green wood to make smoke, wrapped ourselves in whatever fabric we could spare, and still they fed. James Henderson lost his youngest that week. Little Margaret, 3 years old, developed a fever from the bites. Her small body couldn't fight whatever disease the mosquitoes carried. We buried her beside the trail in a shallow grave, marking it with a cairn of stones that would be scattered by the first strong wind. That was when Mary Henderson's eyes changed. They went flat, empty of the hope that had carried her this far. She said nothing at the burial. She said nothing for days afterward. She just stared at the horizon with the expression of a woman who had finally understood what she was walking toward. The mosquitoes were just reconnaissance, nature's scouts, testing our defenses. Our land was beautiful. I need to say that first, because it's important to understand what we were fighting for, and why we didn't turn back when any sane person would have. The claim sat in a valley, where a creek wound through tall prairie grass that turned gold in the late afternoon sun. Trees lined the water cottonwoods, and willows and the soil, when you dug into it, was black and rich. The land agents hadn't lied about that, at least. We arrived in early May, when the prairie was in bloom and the air smelled sweet. Birds sang from the trees. Deer watched us from a distance, curious and unafraid. For 3 days, we worked with genuine enthusiasm, clearing ground for the cabin, setting up tents, planning where the barn would go and how we'd lay out the fields. On the 4th day, a tornado touched down 2 miles west of us. I had never seen one before. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the air became so still and heavy it felt like being underwater. Then the sound started a roar, like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on us at once. We had no shelter except the tents, no cellar, no structure strong enough to withstand what was coming. Stefan Kowalski grabbed Anna and ran for the creek, throwing himself into the water and pulling her under the overhang of the bank. The rest of us scattered into the grass, pressing ourselves flat against the earth, praying to any god that would listen. The funnel passed us by, just barely, close enough that we could feel the suction, see our supplies lifted into the air and scattered across a mile of prairie. close enough that we felt the earth tremble and heard trees snapping like kindling. When it was over, we were alive, but we'd lost half of what we owned: tools, food, canvas, bedding. Daniel found one of our axes embedded in a tree trunk 15 feet off the ground, driven there like a nail dot. James Henderson laughed when he saw it, a desperate, slightly mad laugh that made us all uncomfortable. "Empire," he said, looking at my father. "That man said we'd build an empire out here." We started building the cabin the next morning because we had no other choice. The war intensified as summer came on. Wood was our first enemy. The trees near the creek were green and twisted, wrong for building. We needed straight logs, seasoned if possible, but we'd settle for dead timber that would at least work with a saw. That meant traveling into the ravines to the north, where a lightning strike had left a stand of burned pines. My father and I made the first trip with Stefan. It was a 3-hour walk through grass that came up to our chests, hiding every irregularity in the ground. Stefan stepped into a prairie dog hole and shattered his ankle, so badly the bone came through the skin. The sound he made wasn't human. It was the howl of an animal in a trap, high and broken. We fashioned a stretcher from our coats and young trees, and it took us 6 hours to get him back to camp. Anna wept as she cleaned the wound, knowing what we all knew, that an injury like that, out here, was likely a death sentence. But Stefan survived. Anna set the bone as best she could, wrapped it tight, and for 3 weeks Stefan lay in their tent, sweating through infections and fevers, his skin turning colors that made us look away. He lived, but his leg healed, crooked, short, leaving him with a limp that would mark the rest of his days. We couldn't afford to wait for him to heal. The cabin had to be finished before winter, which meant the rest of us worked double shifts, up before dawn, working until we couldn't see, then working by firelight when moonlight wasn't enough. The logs fought us. They were heavy, unwieldy, slippery with sap. We had one draft horse between 3 families, and she gave out in the heat, dying one afternoon with her heart simply giving up from exhaustion. We butchered her for meat, and then we became the draft animals, hauling logs with ropes in our own backs. I watched my father age 10 years that summer. He was 46 when we started, strong and capable. By August, his hair had gone grey, and his hands were so damaged from rope burns and splinters that he couldn't close them fully. He never complained. None of us did. Complaining used energy we couldn't spare. The heat was its own form of warfare. The prairie in summer was an oven with no walls, just endless sky and sun that beat down until the ground cracked and the grass died. Water became an obsession. The creek shrank to a trickle, and we started making the half-mile walk 3, 4, 5 times a day, carrying buckets that grew heavier with each trip. Daniel collapsed one afternoon, just fell face first into the dirt, heat exhaustion. We carried him to the creek and submerged him in the tepid water, and for an hour I thought I was going to watch my brother die, but he came back, gasping and confused. And the next day he was working again, because there was no other option. The insects continued their assault. Mosquitoes at dusk and dawn, flies during the day, settling on every scrap of food, every wound, every inch of sweat-soaked skin. Chiggers in the grass that burrowed under our clothes and left welts that itched for weeks. Ticks that carried diseases we had no names for. Mary Henderson found a tick behind her son William's ear, swollen to the size of a grape. When she pulled it out, William developed a fever that lasted 5 days. He survived, but it left him weak, diminished. We got the cabin up by September. 4 walls, a roof, a door that didn't quite fit its frame, but kept out most of the wind. It was crude, chinked with mud that would need constant maintenance, but it was shelter. The 3 families would share it through the winter. 20 square feet per person, if you didn't count the space taken up by supplies. We felt victorious as we moved in. We had beaten the summer, beaten the prairie, beaten all the obstacles nature had thrown at us. We were idiots. The real war hadn't even started yet. Winter on the Great Plains doesn't arrive gradually. It comes like an invading army, fast and overwhelming. The first blizzard hit in late October, before we were ready. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind came from the north, bringing snow that didn't fall so much as attack horizontally, driven by gusts that shook the cabin and found every gap in the walls. We crowded inside, all of us, with what livestock we had left to milk cows, a goat and a pig. The animals had to come in or they'd freeze. That meant 13 people and 4 animals in a space barely big enough for 6. All of us breathing the same fetid air, sharing the same diseases, the same fear. The storm lasted 3 days. When it cleared, we opened the door to a world transformed into hostile alien terrain. Snow had drifted 12 feet high in places, burying landmarks, erasing the familiar geography. The temperature sat at 10. James went out first to check on the supplies we'd stored in the lean-to. He came back with his face frozen into a mask of horror. The lean-to had collapsed under the snow's weight. Half our food, stores dried meat, beans, flour, were buried or ruined. We didn't speak for a long time after that. We didn't have to. We could all do the math. It was October. Spring wouldn't come until April. We had enough food for maybe 3 months, if we rationed carefully. Carefully. That word became a curse. Every meal was a negotiation with hunger. We ate less and less, until we were consuming so few calories that simple tasks became exhausting. The children cried from hunger. The adults pretended not to. By December, we were eating things I wouldn't have fed to dogs back in St. Louis. Boiled tree bark to fill our stomachs. Grass seeds ground into a paste. We set snares for rabbits and caught a few tiny things that provided barely a mouthful of meat per person when divided among 13. The cold was relentless, personal, vindictive. It wasn't just discomfort. It was pain that never stopped, that got into your bones and stayed there. We kept a fire going constantly, burning through our woodpile faster than we could replenish it. Going out to gather more wood meant risking frostbite, but not going out meant freezing to death. Inside, Daniel got frostbite on his toes. Despite our precautions, 3 of them turned black. My father heated a knife in the fire and cut them off, while Daniel bit down on a leather strap. There was no doctor, no medicine, no alternative. The wounds got infected anyway. Daniel survived, but he never walked quite right again. Ruth died in January. It wasn't dramatic. She just got weaker and weaker, her body consuming itself for fuel we couldn't provide. One morning she didn't wake up. She'd frozen to death during the night, despite being surrounded by the rest of us. Despite the fire, despite everything we tried to do, we couldn't bury her. The ground was frozen solid, impenetrable. We wrapped her in a blanket and put her in the lean-to, preserved by the cold until spring came and we could dig a proper grave. That night, lying in the dark, I heard James Henderson whispering to his wife. "The children," he said. "We have to think about the children." I knew what he was thinking. We all did. There were stories from other frontiers, other desperate winters, stories about the Donner Party, about starving pioneers who had made unthinkable choices to survive. We didn't speak of it, but we all thought about it, and that might have been the worst part of that winter, not the hunger or the cold, but the knowledge of what we were all capable of if pushed far enough. February brought a thaw, brief and false. The snow melted enough to turn everything to mud, and we discovered what the winter had killed. The milk cows were dead, frozen solid in the night. The goat was dead. The pig somehow survived, though it was so thin you could count every rib. We butchered the cows and the goat right there in the mud, our hands numb, working as fast as we could before predators found the carcasses. Wolves had been circling the cabin for weeks, their howls coming closer each night. Now, with the scent of blood in the air, they grew bold. They came that night, 6 of them, lean and desperate as we were. They circled the cabin, testing the door, scratching at the walls. We could hear them breathing, hear their claws on the frozen ground. James and my father stood by the door with our 2 guns, a rifle and a shotgun, both with limited ammunition. If the wolves broke in, we wouldn't have enough shots for all of them. They never did break in, but they killed Anna's dog, a loyal mutt that had followed them from St. Louis. We found it the next morning, torn apart just yards from the cabin. Anna wept over the body, not just for the dog, but for everything it represented, another piece of our old lives gone, consumed by this place. The false thaw ended. Winter returned with renewed fury, and with it came something worse than cold or hunger: despair. Mary Henderson stopped speaking entirely. She sat in the corner of the cabin, staring at nothing, responding to nothing. Her children tried to reach her, but she was gone. Her mind retreated to somewhere we couldn't follow. Stefan's ankle, which had seemed to heal, reopened. The infection returned, aggressive and foul-smelling. He developed a fever that made him delirious. For 3 days he raved about being back in Poland, calling out for his mother, speaking in a language Anna didn't understand. We thought he would die. We prepared for it, accepting it as inevitable. But somehow, impossibly, the fever broke. He woke up weak but lucid, his ankle still infected but stable. "This place wants us dead," he said to me one night, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not indifferent, it's trying to kill us." I didn't argue. I felt it too. The frontier had a malevolence to it that went beyond simple natural hardship. Every day brought a new assault, a new test, a new way for the land to demonstrate that we weren't welcome here. March came, and with it, the first real hope we'd felt since autumn. The days grew longer. The temperature climbed above freezing and stayed there. The snow began its final retreat, revealing the battered landscape beneath. We had survived, barely, broken, diminished, traumatized, but alive, all except Ruth and little Margaret, and the part of Mary Henderson that would never come back. Spring on the prairie was beautiful again, as though the land was trying to make us forget what it had done to us over the winter. We buried Ruth properly, in the thawing ground near the creek. My father stood over her grave and said nothing, his face empty of expression. Grief was a luxury we couldn't afford. There was too much work to do, because here's what they don't tell you about frontier survival: it never ends. The war never stops. You don't get a season off to recover from the last season's battles. Spring brought planting, which meant breaking soil that fought every inch of the way. It meant seeds that didn't germinate, or sprouted only to be eaten by insects, or grew twisted and stunted in ground that didn't want them. Summer brought drought. The creek dried to a trickle again, and the heat returned with oppressive weight. Our crops struggled. The corn grew short and sparse. The wheat yielded a fraction of what we needed. We'd survived winter only to face the possibility of starvation in the abundance of summer. The Kowalskis left in August. Stefan's ankle would never be right, and they'd lost faith in the land. They packed what little they had and started the long walk back to St. Louis. We never heard from them again. I don't know if they made it. The Hendersons stayed, but they were ghosts of the family that had arrived. James had aged 20 years. The children were quiet, traumatized by what they'd endured. Mary never spoke again. She worked mechanically, following simple instructions. But the woman she'd been was gone. My father, Daniel, and I stayed because we had nothing to go back to. We'd sold everything to come here. This claim was all we had, and walking away meant admitting total defeat. So we stayed, and we fought. And slowly, painfully slowly, we learned how to survive in this place that didn't want us. We learned which plants were edible and which would kill you. We learned to read the sky for storms, to build our shelters stronger, to store food better. We learned to kill efficiently Rupert's deer, prairie chickens, anything that could be eaten. We learned to waste nothing, use everything, respect the constant scarcity that defined existence here. But the cost, God, the cost. It's been 5 years now since we arrived on this claim. 5 years of constant war with the land, the weather, the animals, the insects, the isolation, the fear. We have a functioning farm, barely. We grow enough to survive, most years. We've added to the cabin, built a real barn, cleared more fields. From a distance, You might look at our homestead and think we'd succeeded, but here's the truth they don't tell you in the land. Offices back in St. Louis. This isn't living. This is surviving. Every single day is a battle just to see the next sunrise. You don't build empires out here. You build scars, physical ones on your hands and back, emotional ones in the places where hope used to live. Daniel will never run again. He limps on his maimed foot, and on cold days, the phantom pain from his missing toes makes him gasp. My father has been broken by this place. He does the work, but mechanically, without joy or purpose. Sometimes I catch him staring at Ruth's grave, and I know he's wishing he was in the ground beside her. James Henderson shot himself last winter, walked out into a blizzard, put the rifle under his chin, and pulled the trigger. Mary found him 3 days later when the storm cleared. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, looking at his frozen body, her face expressing nothing. More families have come to the territory, fresh-faced settlers full of hope and dreams, believing the same lies we believed. We see their wagons passing, see the excitement in their eyes. We don't warn them. What would we say? That the frontier isn't an adventure, but a meat grinder that consumes lives and spirits with equal efficiency. That the land is beautiful and deadly. That it offers opportunity only to those who are willing to trade pieces of themselves for every small victory. They wouldn't believe us anyway, just like we didn't believe the few weathered souls who tried to warn us back in St. Louis. That's what we are now. Not pioneers, not adventurers, not homesteaders building a bright future. We're soldiers in a war that never ends, fighting an enemy that never tires, never retreats, never surrenders. The frontier is the enemy, not the Native Americans we displaced. That's a different evil, a different shame we carry. But the land itself, the natural world that kills so casually and constantly. Every morning we wake up is a battle won. Every winter survived is a major victory. Every harvest, no matter how meager, is a triumph worth celebrating because we fought the elements and didn't completely lose. But we're losing ourselves in the process. Look in the mirror. Luxury. A piece of glass we traded for last year, and I don't recognize the man looking back. I'm 28 years old and I look 50. My hands are gnarled, scarred, permanently stained with dirt that won't wash out. My back aches constantly from years of labor my body wasn't designed for. My eyes have the same flatness I saw in Mary Henderson's eyes that first summer. The look of someone who understands too much. The dreams I had as a young man of building something, creating something, making a mark on the world seem laughable now. I dream only of survival. Another season, another year, not freezing, not starving, not dying. There's no triumphant conclusion to this story. No moment where the war ends and peace arrives. The frontier doesn't work that way. Next spring, we'll plant again. Some of the crops will grow, some will fail. Summer will be hot and probably dry. Winter will be cold and possibly deadly. And we'll fight through all of it again, because that's what you do when you're in a war. You fight, or you die, or you retreat. Sometimes new settlers stop at our homestead, asking for advice. They're always so young, so hopeful. They want to know the secrets of successful farming out here, the tricks to thriving on the prairie. I tell them the truth. There are no secrets. There is no thriving. There's only survival. Day by day, season by season, year by year. The frontier isn't an opportunity. It's an ordeal. And if you're very strong, very lucky, and very stubborn, you might endure it long enough to call it a life. Some of them thank me and move on, undeterred. Others I see doubt creeping into their eyes. Those are the smart ones. Those are the ones who might turn back before the frontier breaks them. But most will stay. Most will fight. Most will lose pieces of themselves to this beautiful, terrible place. And in 100 years, people will read about us in history books, about the brave pioneers who settled the frontier and built America. They'll make it sound noble, heroic, an adventure. They'll be wrong. It wasn't adventure. It was war with nature, and nature mostly won. This story is fiction, but it's based on the documented experiences of real frontier families who homesteaded in the American West during the 1800s. The mortality rates, the hardships, the constant struggle, all of that is historically accurate. We romanticize the frontier in American mythology, but the reality was far darker and more brutal than most people realize. The pioneers who survived weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were casualties of a war they didn't fully understand. They were fighting until it was too late to retreat.